Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday to you all. It's a pleasure and delight that you've decided to take some time this morning to join us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And yes, if you haven't met me yet, I'm Dan. I'm a teaching pastor here at Redeeming Life. And it's our business today to continue this journey to read the entire New Testament over the course of a year that's been leading us through the Gospels and Acts and the epistles, and that yesterday, Sunday, we did an introduction to this book called Revelation. And we're going to be today in Revelation chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. And for today and the next following days, we're going to be taking this journey through the epistles of Revelation. That's the section in which the revelation as a whole that John is sitting down to write is getting circulated through 7 different churches throughout Asia Minor. And the particular importance, at least, of choosing 7 different churches, because what we know, there were, by this time, lots more than just 7 churches spread throughout Asia Minor. But the choice of 7 means that this apocalypse is addressed not simply merely to these particular 7 churches, but also to the church universal, the whole lot. The church spread out through all of time and eternity that includes people like you and me. So it's important that whatever message that John is sitting down to write to churches like from Ephesus and Pergamum and Smyrna and Philadelphia, that the message is just as relevant for us today as it was for them. And so we should have open ears and open hearts to be able to listen to what John has to say, what God has to say to them through John, and also what it is that he wants to show us. And one of the striking features about this is that you'll find this refrain after you read through each and every address. It's closed up is with this refrain that is, to he who overcomes, which tells you, or at least it indicates somewhat, that if the church is going to overcome something, that means that trials and sufferings and persecution is probably going to be at the doorstep. Indeed, it is at the doorstep, as we're going to find out in this this letter addressed to the second church, but we won't get ahead of ourselves. So that when you hear this constant refrain, to he who overcomes, or in some translations, to he who conquers, nikao, as to emerge victorious in the end, that this message that we're about to read with Revelation as a whole is in service to that particular end. It's supposed to be instrumental in the lives of us Christians, that we, like them, are going to be conquerors, that we're going to be overcomers. And what you'll see within each of these letters to different churches is a key to about what it actually means to be an overcomer, to be, in other words, a conqueror, a winner, a victorious in the end. And in short, each of these lessons on how to overcome are inevitably lessons in how to follow in Jesus' footsteps and to be like Jesus, to live like Jesus, so that the people who overcome are the people who walked as Jesus walked and lived as Jesus lived. And that's the path towards overcoming and what it means to be a people who belong to God. And that's how the church is actually going to not just survive, but to overcome. And because what we're also going to see is that survival doesn't necessarily mean overcoming, and death doesn't necessarily mean the end. And so with this in mind, let's read through. It's only 11 verses today, but there is so much to ponder over in each of these letters. But the message the thought that we want to carry with us throughout this journey reading these letters to the seven churches, reading the letters to the church universal, is about what does it mean to overcome. So, with this in mind, let's read Revelation beginning in chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, which is the letter to the church in Ephesus. So it reads this. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Remember from the previous chapter that the 7 golden lampstands are references to the 7 churches, and that God, Jesus, he's depicted as walking among the 7 lampstands who are among God's presence, and that the image that John wants to display is about God's presence in their midst. That Jesus is with them even in the midst of this suffering and the persecution. That if Jesus is walking among the golden lampstands, that's an image of God's presence in the midst of this church in Ephesus. And indeed, God's presence in our midst as the church. But let's continue. Verse 2. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know you cannot tolerate the wicked men, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary. What a tough and faithful bunch. They almost seem like, leather-necked Green Berets, people who have just toughed it out and have held fast to the truth. They've not given into lies. Sounds like a picture of a faithful church, the true church, a church that is pleasing in the sight of God. Let's continue to read. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken your first love. Remember the height from which you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. In other words, the thing that you are now, you're not going to be anymore. You're going to cease to being the church, to being a light that represents the light of God's presence among the nations. You're no longer going to be that if you forsake your first love. The love of God that softens our hearts and beckons us to walk humbly before God. That's the thing that has been lost among the church in Ephesus. In that if they lose that, they will cease to be the real church. And that is such an important lesson for us today. That, all of the things that they are doing, their deeds, their hard work, perseverance, that they will not tolerate wickedness, that they've tested apostles and found the counterfeits and exposed them. They've persevered. They've endured hardships. And through it all, they're not even growing weary. They're as strong as ever. And yet, all of that is nothing if they've lost their first love. And for all of the things that we do and is important for us to do, to hold fast to the truth, to persevere under trial, to endure and to not grow weary. What good are all of those things if we have lost or forsaken our first love? If our hearts have grown cold and bitter and resentful because we've fallen away from the love that first drew us to God in the first place. Let us not lose our first love. And it says, but continue. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practice of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. The Nicolaitans, probably in reference to a heretical group that has basically taken spiritual license to, or presumed on spiritual license to engage in idolatry and immorality. That's as best as what we know from church history. But let's continue. It says, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So one key in what it means to be an overcomer, we cannot forsake our first love. But if we hold fast to that first love, that is a key step about what it means to be victorious over Satan, to be victorious over the powers of evil, to indeed endure, to be a conqueror. You have to have the first love of God that first drew us to him in the first place. So let's continue. To the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now we'll pause there for a second. What on earth could he possibly mean by a synagogue of Satan? In all likelihood, this is a demonstration or a depiction of what is in reality people who are members of a synagogue, that is a meeting of Jews, and that who have been excommunicated on account of their faithfulness to Jesus, and that people within within the synagogue have slandered them and turned them over to the Romans and denouncing them as not real Jews, which, if you can prove your status as a Jew, and that's recognized under the state of Rome as a legitimate church, as a legitimate religion, it falls under a protected status. But that there are people who are, under this protected status who are denouncing them and saying, no, they are not real Jews. And so that makes them as targets for persecution. That's probably something that's happening here in the church of Smyrna. And it says, do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Pause there. The suffering is going to come. And he says, you are about to suffer this, but don't be afraid. There's another key in what it means to be an overcomer. It says, I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. And what's the key here in being an overcomer? Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. It's interesting. I remember reading in the Screwtape Letters, that's work by C.S. Lewis that we might talk about later. You know that I'm a sort of a Lewis junkie, but one of the lessons that I had learned about in the Screwtape Letters is that Satan, in his attempts to seduce and trap and devour human spirits like you and me, is that he teaches us that death is the prime evil and survival is the greatest good. And that's not true in the eyes of God, but that faithfulness, even to the point of death, is how some members within the church are going to overcome, which is interesting, because in any other circumstance, if you die, that means you're not a conqueror. You've been overtaken by somebody. But in this case, faithfulness, even to the point of death, is to walk the path that Jesus walked. And to follow in his steps in this way is the path towards conquering, is the path towards overcoming, is the path that God calls his people to walk. is faithfulness even to the point of death. And so, lastly, it says this, verse 11, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. This certainly sounds a lot like when Jesus said to not fear those who can kill the body, but not the soul, but rather to fear the one who can throw both the body and the soul into eternal torment. That the biblical picture of an overcomer is a person who will give their life in faithfulness to God, and to then receive life, God's life, his everlasting life in God's eternal kingdom, which is a fruit, a reward that is imperishable. Hence why he's offering us a crown of life. That is certainly something worth suffering and dying for. And it's important also to remember that not everybody who has ever followed Jesus has died for their faith, indeed been martyred. And so it doesn't mean that all of us have to die for our faith, but rather that each and every one of us has a quality of enduring faith that even death itself cannot overcome. So that if the nature of the faithfulness and the resolve and the faithfulness to God is one that we would pay for with our very lives, that's the kind of faith that you and I need. And that it's that kind of faith that we need to be an overcomer. So, thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And if you haven't, I encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or check out our podcasts, and also consider supporting us for this church planting work here in Whitley County, and just be a part of this mission about growing mature disciples and just following through with what God has called us to do here in the community of Whitley County. So God bless you. Take care, and I look forward to seeing you next time.